The hangar hummed with high voltage. A $30 million jet gleamed under the lights. Victoria Hale, a ruthless CEO, stood with crossed arms. Facing her was Adrian, a single dad in a faded jacket. She pointed at the cockpit. "Fly this jet first, then we'll talk." Technician snickered. He was just a mechanic now. He didn't flinch. He looked at the landing gear, then at her. "If the regulations allow it, I will." He walked past the open door. He didn't climb in. He grabbed the maintenance logs. The laughter died. The hangar went silent, waiting for him to fail spectacularly. Minutes later, the engine screamed. His name was Adrian Walker, 47 years old, with graying temples that spoke of sleepless nights, a face etched with deep lines of patience, and the kind of steady, unblinking eyes that had once stared down thunderstorms at 40,000 feet over the Pacific. He was a single father. His heart, his soul, and his entire rigid schedule belonged to his 11-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily was currently sitting in the small, glass-walled waiting room of the Hale Aviation private terminal, separated from the hangar floor by a thick pane of soundproof glass. She was quietly doing her geography homework, biting the end of her pencil, her legs swinging back and forth in a rhythm only she could hear. Occasionally, she would look up, scanning the hangar for her dad, checking to make sure he was still there, still safe. She knew he hated this place. She knew the smell of jet fuel reminded him of Mom. She was the anchor that kept him tethered to the ground. She was also the reason he hadn't touched a flight stick in 6 long, agonizing years. Adrian used to be a legend in the industry. He was a senior commercial captain for a major international carrier, rated for heavy jets like the Boeing 747 and Airbus A380, with a safety record that was statistically perfect across 15,000 flight hours. He had flown presidents, rock stars, and emergency evacuations. He knew the sky better than he knew the ground. But 6 years ago, a devastating family tragedy, the sudden, brutal loss of his wife to an aneurysm, had grounded him permanently. He remembered the call. He was at 38,000 feet, somewhere over the Atlantic, commanding a Boeing 777. The sat phone rang. By the time he landed 8 hours later, she was gone. He never got to say goodbye. The guilt of being in the air while his world collapsed on the ground had shattered his love for flying. The unpredictability of commercial rosters, the nights away in foreign hotels while his daughter cried for her mother, the missed birthdays, the empty chair at the dinner table. It became impossible. He couldn't raise a grieving daughter from a cockpit. He couldn't be a father via FaceTime. So he made the impossible choice. He hung up his wings. He folded his uniform and put it in a box he never opened. He traded the glory of the skies for a pair of grease-stained coveralls and became a contract maintenance technician. He fixed the birds he used to fly. It was safer. It was stable. It let him be home to cook spaghetti at 6 p.m. every night. The woman standing opposite him was Victoria Hale, 41 years old, sharp as a turbine blade, dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than Adrian's car. She was the CEO of Hale Global Logistics, a company that moved the world's most valuable cargo. She was currently in the middle of a staffing crisis that was threatening to cripple her executive movements. Her lead pilot had just quit for a competitor without notice, and she needed a new director of flight operations immediately. She had been interviewing candidates all week. They were all the same. Arrogant Top Gun wannabes, flashy cowboys obsessed with their flight hours, men who treated her $30 million jet like a weekend toy. They talked about speed, about luxury, about perks. She was tired of cowboys. She needed a professional. She needed someone who understood that the cargo in the back was worth billions. Then came Adrian's resume. It had been pulled from the bottom of the pile by her HR director, almost by accident. Victoria looked at the file in her hands, her brow furrowing. It was a paradox. Thousands of hours of command time, ratings on almost every major airframe from Boeing to Gulfstream, instructor certifications. But his commercial license had lapsed. He hadn't logged a professional flight in over half a decade. He was currently listed on her payroll as a Level 3 maintenance consultant. "Mr. Walker," Victoria said, looking up from the file, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. He didn't stand like a mechanic. He stood with the relaxed, disciplined posture of a military officer. Your resume is a paradox. You have more heavy jet experience than my entire current crew combined. You have logged more hours in the last 10 years than most pilots fly in a lifetime. Yet you are applying for an operational advisory role. You want to sit at a desk? You want to audit logs? Adrian stood calmly, his hands clasped behind his back, a habit from his early days in the Air Force Academy that he couldn't quite shake. He met her gaze without flinching. I am applying for the position that allows me to pick up my daughter at 4 p.m., Ms. Hale. My flying days are behind me. I offer experience, oversight, and safety. I don't offer flight hours. Victoria didn't like that answer. She didn't trust people who walked away from power. In her world, if you had a talent, you used it. If you possessed a gift like flight and you abandoned it, you were either hiding a dark secret or you had lost your nerve. She needed to know which one it was. She couldn't entrust her fleet to a man who was afraid of the sky. She looked at the man in the faded jacket. He didn't look like a pilot anymore. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been beaten down by life's cruel unpredictability. But his eyes were still scanning the hangar, checking safety perimeters, noting fire extinguisher locations, watching the movement of the fuel truck. He was still a captain in his mind. She decided to push him. She decided to break the polite interview protocol and see what was actually underneath that calm, resigned exterior. She needed to shake the rust off. Victoria snapped the file folder shut with a sharp thud. The sound echoed in the cavernous hangar, drawing the attention of the ground crew. She turned on her heel, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished concrete, and walked toward the massive Gulfstream G650ER parked in the center bay. It was a magnificent beast, currently being prepped for a routine maintenance check flight. You say you understand operational reality, Mr. Walker? Victoria asked, her voice raising slightly, challenging him. She stopped right in front of the nose gear, resting her hand on the cold aluminum skin of the aircraft. She turned to face him. She gestured grandly to the $30 million machine, her other hand sweeping across the horizon of the hangar. Fly this jet first. The hangar went dead silent. The sound of pneumatic drills stopped. The maintenance crew lowered their tools. The current chief pilot, a man named Captain Miller who was standing by the wing checking the fuel load, looked up in genuine surprise. Adrian didn't blink. He didn't smile. He didn't rush forward to grab the glory or touch the plane he clearly loved. I beg your pardon? Adrian asked, his voice level, devoid of the excitement she expected. You heard me, Victoria said, crossing her arms, her chin lifting defiantly. You want to advise my fleet? You want to tell my pilots how to fly? Show me you still know what a jet feels like. Show me you haven't forgotten the difference between a simulator and reality. Take it up, right now. It was a test, a trap. Victoria expected one of two things. Either he would eagerly jump at the chance to fly a luxury jet, proving he was just another arrogant pilot missing the spotlight and lying about his priorities, or he would refuse out of fear, proving he had lost his nerve and was useless to her. Adrian stood perfectly still. He looked at the jet. He looked at the maintenance logs sitting on a rolling cart nearby. He looked at Captain Miller measuring the man's stance. He didn't move toward the pilot's door. He didn't take the bait. Under whose authority? Adrian asked quietly. Victoria frowned, confused by his lack of movement. Excuse me? Who is the pilot in command? Adrian clarified, his voice hardening just a fraction, taking on the tone of a safety inspector. This aircraft is currently logged for a maintenance cycle. I am a contractor. I do not have a current commercial medical certificate. I cannot legally act as PIC, pilot in command. So I ask again, under whose authority am I entering that cockpit? Because if you are asking me to violate FAA regulations to impress you, the interview is over. Victoria paused. She hadn't expected a lecture on regulations. She expected ego. She expected bravado. She expected him to beg for the keys. Captain Miller stepped forward, sensing the tension radiating from the CEO. I am the PIC for this check flight, Ms. Hale. The flight plan is filed under my name. I am responsible for the aircraft. Adrian nodded to Captain Miller respectfully, acknowledging the chain of command. Then he turned back to Victoria. If Captain Miller retains command, and if he requires a second-in-command for this check flight due to crew shortage, I can legally occupy the right seat under supervision, but only if the insurance binder covers non-employee operators for maintenance verification. He walked over to the maintenance cart. He didn't look at the shiny jet with longing. He looked at the paperwork. He picked up the heavy clipboard. He spent 3 agonizing minutes reading the technical logs, checking the tire pressure records, verifying the hydraulic fluid levels, and calculating the fuel load distribution. He scrutinized the oil consumption history of the left engine, tapping his finger on a discrepancy from 3 weeks ago that hadn't been fully addressed. He checked the minimum equipment list, MEL, to ensure no critical systems were deferred. Victoria watched him, stunned. Most pilots would have killed to fly her jet. This man was auditing the paperwork. He was checking the fine print. He was looking for reasons not to fly if it wasn't safe. "Are you stalling, Mr. Walker?" Victoria asked, her tone sharp, impatience creeping in. "Are you afraid you've forgotten how to fly?" Adrian looked up from the clipboard. His gaze was piercing, stripping away her CEO persona. "Ms. Hale, aviation is not a performance art. It is the management of risk. I don't fly for fun. I don't fly to show off. I fly when the aircraft is ready and the paperwork is legal. The aircraft is ready. The paperwork is valid. The vibration on engine 2 is within tolerance, but I'll be watching it." He put the clipboard down with a deliberate calm. "I will fly as second officer, but I will not perform for you. I will fly the plane." The atmosphere inside the cockpit was clinical, cold, and smelled of new leather and avionics cooling fans. Captain Miller sat in the left seat, the command seat. Adrian sat in the right seat, the co-pilot station. Victoria, breaking her own safety protocol, sat in the jump seat directly behind them, wearing a headset. She wanted to see every move. She wanted to see his hands shake. Adrian adjusted his seat. He didn't touch the controls with the hunger of a man who missed flying. He touched them with the familiarity of a man putting on an old, comfortable pair of gloves. He adjusted the rudder pedals. He checked the oxygen mask. He punched the flight plan into the flight management system, FMS, with rapid, practiced keystrokes, his fingers moving from memory, verifying waypoints and altitude restrictions faster than Miller could even read them. "Checklist," Adrian said. His voice on the intercom was different now. It wasn't the voice of a tired single dad. It was the voice of a captain. It was deep, resonant, and absolutely devoid of emotion. "Electrical system," Miller responded, falling into the rhythm. "Check. Hydraulics. Check. APU. Running. Engine start sequence." Adrian reached for the start switches. He engaged the starter for the left engine. A low hum began to vibrate through the airframe, growing into a whine, and then a roar as the massive Rolls-Royce BR-725 engine caught fire and stabilized. He watched the N1 rotation speed and the interstage turbine temperature, ITT, like a hawk looking for any anomaly, his hand hovering over the cutoff switch just in case. "Trim setting." Adrian paused. His hand hovered over the pitch trim wheel. He stared at the central display screen, squinting slightly. He didn't move. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The only sound was the hum of the engines and the cooling fans. Victoria leaned forward, tapping her headset. "What's the problem? Why are we waiting? The runway is clear. Ground control has given us the green light." Adrian ignored her completely. He looked at Captain Miller. "Captain, the load sheet says we have 400 pounds of ballast in the aft cargo hold for the sensor test, but the digital trim indicator is showing a center of gravity bias of 2.1 units nose up." Miller frowned, looking at his own display. "It's within limits, Adrian. It's in the green band. It's safe." "It is safe," Adrian agreed calmly, "but it's not precise. If we rotate at V1 speed with this trim, the nose will feel light. We will over-rotate by 3 degrees. It won't be smooth. It will feel sloppy. The passengers in the back would spill their coffee. We are not hauling cargo, Captain. We are hauling executives." Victoria rolled her eyes, exhaling loudly. "We are burning fuel, sitting here debating math. Just go." Adrian took his hand off the throttle. He turned around in his seat to face the CEO, his eyes locking onto hers. "Ms. Hale, you asked me to fly. If I fly, I balance the aircraft. We are not driving a bus. We are operating a precision instrument at 180 miles per hour." He turned back to Miller, requesting permission to adjust pitch trim manually to 1.8 units to compensate for the aft ballast distribution. Miller looked at Adrian with a newfound respect. Most pilots wouldn't have even noticed the micro discrepancy. They would have just yanked the stick back and corrected it in the air. "Permission granted, set 1.8. Adrian adjusted the wheel. Click, click, click. "Trim set, ready for taxi." The jet taxied to the runway. The engines roared to takeoff power. The noise was a deafening, powerful symphony. The acceleration pressed them back into their seats, a heavy, invisible hand shoving them forward. Adrian's hand guarded the throttles, feeling the vibration, making sure both engines spooled up perfectly symmetrically. Victoria braced herself against the seat. She expected Adrian to show off. She expected a steep, aggressive climb, a fighter pilot takeoff to prove he was a tough guy who hadn't lost his edge. Instead, she felt nothing. The takeoff was so smooth, so incredibly gradual, that Victoria didn't even realize they had left the ground until she looked out the window and saw the hangar roofs shrinking below them. There was no lurch. There was no G-force slam. It was like floating on a cloud. Adrian flew the departure procedure with robotic, boring perfection. He didn't bank hard. He didn't accelerate fast. He kept the needle exactly, perfectly in the center of the display. "Passing 10,000 feet, Adrian said. "Landing lights off." He checked the fuel flow. He adjusted the mixture. He monitored the oil pressure. He did absolutely nothing exciting. He didn't smile. He didn't look out the window to admire the view. He watched the instruments. It was the most boring flight Victoria had ever been on. And as she watched his hands, steady, relaxed, barely moving the stick, using only his fingertips, she realized something profound. He wasn't trying to impress her. He didn't care about impressing her. He cared about the machine. He cared about the physics. He cared about the safety of the souls on board. He scanned the instruments with a rhythmic, predator-like intensity. His eyes darted from airspeed to altitude to engine temp. He noticed a minor fluctuation in the number 2 engine exhaust gas temperature, EGT, before the computer even flagged it. "Captain, engine 2 EGT is trending high by 4 degrees, Adrian murmured. "Suggest reducing thrust by 2% to stabilize thermal load. We might have a slightly dirty injector." "Copy," Miller said, instantly complying, looking surprised that Adrian caught it so fast. The flight lasted 45 minutes. They circled the airfield. They tested the flaps. They tested the landing gear deployment. Then came the landing. Adrian lined up the runway. The crosswind was gusting at 20 knots, a choppy, difficult wind that usually made for bumpy landings. The windsock was practically horizontal. Victoria gripped her armrests, bracing for the impact. She remembered her last pilot, who would wrestle the plane onto the ground in winds like this. Adrian didn't fight the wind. He danced with it. He made tiny, microscopic corrections with the rudder pedals. He crabbed the plane sideways, then kicked it straight at the last possible second. The wheels touched the tarmac with a kiss so gentle it was barely a whisper. Screech, chirp, no bounce, no slam. Just contact. He deployed the reversers. He applied the brakes smoothly, progressively, ensuring the passengers wouldn't be thrown forward against their seatbelts. They taxied back to the hangar. Adrian ran the shutdown checklist. He turned off the fuel pumps. The engines whined down into silence. The cockpit went dark. Adrian took off his headset. He placed it neatly on the hook. He turned to Victoria. He didn't smile. He didn't ask, "How was that?" or wait for a compliment. He simply said, "Parking brake set. Flight complete." The cabin door opened. The warm, thick air of the hangar rushed in, smelling of oil and ozone. Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt. She sat there for a moment, processing what she had just seen. She had expected a show. She had expected a cowboy who wanted to prove he was still the king of the sky. Instead, she had found a surgeon. She realized that for 45 minutes, she hadn't felt fear. She hadn't felt the need to micromanage. She had just felt safe. They walked down the air stairs to the concrete floor. The maintenance crew was waiting, leaning against toolboxes, expecting a story of aerial acrobatics. Adrian didn't say a word to them about the flight. He walked straight to the nose gear, patted the fuselage gently as if thanking the machine, and then turned to Captain Miller. He began a post-flight walk around inspection immediately, checking the brake pads for excessive heat. "Captain," Adrian said, his voice professional, low and serious. "The aircraft flies straight, but the right aileron feels stiff on the return. It's delaying the roll rate by maybe half a second. It's barely noticeable, but it's there. Have the boys check the cable tension in the right wing root. It's safe, but it's annoying, and it will increase pilot fatigue on long hauls." Miller nodded enthusiastically, taking notes on his iPad. "I felt that too, but I thought it was the wind." "Good catch, Adrian. I'll have maintenance open the panel tonight." Victoria walked up to Adrian. Her arms were no longer crossed. Her defensive, aggressive posture was gone. She looked at him with curiosity instead of judgment. She had checked the flight data recorder trace on her phone app as they taxied in. The G-force graph was practically a flat line. "You didn't show off," Victoria stated. It wasn't a question. Adrian picked up his worn jacket from the maintenance cart and slid it on, covering the pilot-like posture with the look of a workman. "You didn't ask for a stunt pilot, Ms. Hale," Adrian replied quietly. "You asked for an operator. A boring flight is a safe flight. If you notice the pilot, he's doing something wrong. If the coffee spills, I failed." Victoria looked at him intently. "You hesitated on the tarmac, and you hesitated before takeoff with the trim setting. I thought you were scared. I thought you had lost your nerve." Adrian stopped zipping his jacket. He looked her dead in the eye, his expression hardening. "I didn't hesitate because I was scared, Victoria. I hesitated because I was checking the variables. Fear is a reaction. Hesitation is a decision. I don't move a $30 million asset with lives on board until I know exactly where it's going to end up. That's not fear. That's responsibility." The answer hung in the air. It was the answer of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone but himself. A man who had buried a wife and learned that life is fragile, and safety is the only thing that matters. Victoria looked toward the glass waiting room. She saw Lily, the little girl with the messy ponytail and the geography textbook, press her face against the glass and wave excitedly at her dad. Adrian waved back, his face instantly softening into a bright, genuine, heart-melting smile that he hadn't shown all day. He wasn't the captain anymore. He was just Dad. Victoria made a decision. She didn't need another hotshot. She needed a grown-up. "I don't want you as a consultant," Victoria said abruptly. Adrian sighed, looking down at his boots. "I understand. I don't have the current license for the captain's seat anyway. I'll go back to the maintenance bay." "I don't want you as a captain," Victoria corrected him, stepping closer. "I want you as my director of flight operations." Adrian paused. He looked up, stunned. That was a senior executive role. It paid 3 times what he was asking. It was a suit and tie job. "I need someone who hesitates," Victoria continued, her voice firm and commanding. "I have plenty of pilots who can fly fast. I have plenty of pilots who have egos the size of this hangar. I need a man who knows when not to fly. I need a man who checks the trim before he pushes the throttle. I need a man who puts safety above his own ego. I need a father who understands what it means to come home." Adrian looked at Lily again. "The hours... I can't do the late nights, Ms. Hale. I can't travel." "The hours are yours," Victoria said. "You run the department from the ground. You set the standards. You train my crews. You fly when you want to keep your hand in. But your primary job is to make sure my crews fly like you just did. Boring, safe, precise." She extended her hand. "And you leave at 4 p.m. every day. Lily needs her dad more than I need a meeting." Adrian looked at her hand. For the first time in 6 years, he felt like he wasn't just fixing broken things. He felt like he was building something. He felt like he could be a pilot and a father. He shook her hand firmly. "I'll start tomorrow." The next week, the culture at Hale Aviation changed. The cowboys were retrained or let go. The checklists were tightened. The flights became boring, precise, and impeccably safe. And Adrian Walker, the single dad who hesitated, became the most respected man in the company. Not because he was the fastest pilot in the sky, but because he was the only one brave enough to slow down. If you believe that true professionalism is knowing when to pause, check, and think before you act, hit that subscribe button to follow more stories of real mastery. Tell us in the comments, are you the type of person who jumps in immediately, or do you hesitate and plan? Which one has saved you before?